Hello there, I'm Doug Munro, and today I'm going to talk about Ken Gillion and the making of his book, Fiji's Indian Migrants. Well, one of the legacies of Indian indenture is literary, where the fiction, poetry, contemporary eyewitness and participant accounts, and not least the corpus of academic writing on the subject. Among the latter is Ken Gillion's Fiji's Indian Migrants, subtitled A History to the End of Indenture in 1920, which was published in 1962 and is one of the foundational texts of the new Pacific Islands historiography, which was developed at the Australian National University by J.W. Davidson in the 1950s and the 1960s. Indeed, the book is a revision of a PhD thesis supervised by Davidson. It was submitted in early 1958, and it concerns the 61,000 indentured labourers from India to Fiji. Now, my presentation concerns the book's backstory, not so much about the book's content, although there will be some of that, but what went into its making and what it says about its author. But first, some context. Gillion, a New Zealander, as was Davidson, graduated from Victoria University College in 1951, tender age of 22, with a Master of Arts for a thesis titled The Indian Political Problem. For the next 4 years, he worked in the New Zealand Diplomatic Service, and then he was awarded a PhD scholarship at the Australian National University, which I'll abbreviate to ANU. Arriving at the ANU in 1955, settled on a PhD on the history of the Indian community in Fiji, although this was later abbreviated the Institution of Indenture. Short order, he produced a competent and rounded literature survey. He required very little guidance, started learning Hindi, and in August, he sallied off for archival research and fieldwork to India, England, and Fiji that lasted for 2 years. He experienced considerable difficulties getting access to archival material in India. Permission had to be granted often from high places, and the junior officials were timid and obstructive. But on a sea voyage between Sri Lanka and Madras, he met a professor and his students and was invited to join the party, and they took him on a tour of South India. It was one of a number of episodes that imparted in Gillion an abiding love of Indian civilization and culture, and which prompted him to regard his work on Fiji as an apprenticeship to becoming a historian of India. Working in the Public Records Office in the British Museum in the United Kingdom was a delight after India, he said. And in September 1957, after 12 months in India and England, Gillion was on his way to Fiji for the final and longest part of his fieldwork. Now, Fiji at the time was still a crown colony. Davidson, in the meanwhile, had maintained good relations with the colonial authorities there on behalf of his students, and he had written personally to the governor of Fiji requesting that Gillion have access to restricted post-1902 archival records. Permission was eventually granted, although Gillion took it out of him, and he did say that he felt as though he was sitting on the top of a volcano. And it's just as well that Gillion gained access to these records, because almost 2/3 of the Indian indentured labourers arrived after 1900. And this was the interesting period, when the system was under investigation and abolished. Gillion would not have had a viable thesis topic without access to these records, or else the thesis would have been unsatisfactorily restricted to the early years of Indian indenture in Fiji, and the book eventually emerged would not have had the same impact. Ken returned to the ANU in late July 1957 after an almost 2-year absence. He'd already written about half the thesis, or drafted half the thesis, during his evenings in Fiji. But meanwhile, the thesis itself was whittled down from the original conception of a broad-ranging history, and it was essentially a history of the indenture period from 1879 until 1920. Even so, it ran into almost 500 pages of text. It was submitted in early 1958 and duly passed by the examiners. Now, the thesis has a number of features. Most obviously is the depth of the research. The research base is impeccable. The array of sources is impressive. It provided a model for future scholars. Second was the degree of quantification, as there has to be in the study of emigration. But that was not so evident in the historiography of the time. So in other words, Gillion was going far beyond established practice. Another way in which he went beyond established practice was that rather than confining himself to the political and the administrative sides of the story, he delved into the lives of the immigrants and made no bones that the plantation experience was dismal and degrading. Impersonality and drudgery was one of his expressions. To that end, he interviewed far more people than his footnotes would indicate. He would have interviewed about 40 former Gametias, but he was not proficient enough in Hindi, so he had to do this with the aid of an interpreter. Lastly, he stressed that his was a narrative history. It was descriptive rather than analytical, he said. Here he was doing himself less than justice in that he explains, or really what I should say is he explains how outcomes came about. Analysis, in other words, firmly embedded in the narrative. Now, Gillion was anxious for his thesis to be published, but some revisions had already been done for him, in a sense. As a condition of access to the restricted material in Fiji, he had to sign an agreement allowing the officials to vet his thesis prior to publication. One of their objections was that Indian indenture could not be equated with the Atlantic slave trade, Gillion had originally said. Well, he meekly obliged and cut that out of his narrative. Other revisions were actually easier said than done. For a start, he had been appointed to a lectureship at the University of Western Australia, and he got bogged down with teaching unfamiliar subjects. 2 years later, and this was in December 1960, he was complaining that the rewriting of the thesis was at a standstill. But the same doggedness and resolve that enabled him to write a draft of half the thesis while still in the field came through again. And 4 months later, he was telling Davidson that he had completed a very extensive rewriting. The referees were not satisfied. One of the reports survives, and it's clear that Gillion had not converted his thesis into a book to a sufficient extent. In the thesis, Gillion had stressed that because this is a pioneer work, comprehensiveness of treatment has been aimed at, and some details have been included. It's a deliberate concession for the record, since such a record does not exist elsewhere. Well, that referee's criticism, or one of them, was that Gillion had not shed enough superfluous detail, so the manuscript underwent another rewrite. In the process, the 3 chapters on administration, or the administration of the system, were conflated into one, and the 2 chapters on plantation life were reduced to one, and the book was eventually published in March of 1962. It did receive a cordial reception, but there is a paradox in that the reviewers routinely asserted that Gillion was too much concerned with balance, unquote, resulting in an excessive degree of caution in coming to conclusions. There was certainly an austerity, as Davidson expressed, in the political and administrative chapters. But Gillion is concerned to weigh up all facets of the situation. Sometimes he got accused of having two bob each way. But I remain unconvinced by the critics, and also with Davidson's other view that Gillion didn't make most of its sources. I mean, how could Davidson know this, not having seen the sources for himself? What I suspect is that Gillion became a victim of a whispering campaign. This idea of balance started up and it got repeated and repeated. What the critics overlooked was a somewhat glaring duality of the book, because the account of plantation life is overtly condemnatory, I'm sorry, having trouble pronouncing, an overtly condemnation in tone. As if to reinforce this, Gillion appropriated the moralistic language of the opponents of the indenture system, particularly the missionaries. Thus, Hugh Tinker's claim in his A New System of Slavery, published in 1974, Gillion was perhaps a little too concerned with balance, see that word again, and for sometimes holding back from a most searching probe into the sordid side of the indenture is arrant nonsense. When reviewing A New System of Slavery, for his part, Gillion accused Tinker of writing an emotive denunciation of the system as the successor of the African slave trade, seemingly unaware that his was just as emotive an account of plantation life. So there's this duality in Fiji's Indian migrants. It's sober and judicious on the administrative side, quite the opposite came to the plantation regime. And this duality fitted with Gillion's personality, which involved a marked tendency to be highly judgmental. As Davidson said, and which I can aver from personal experience with Gillion, he was possessed of a quirky morality that led him too readily to condemn persons and situations he found uncongenial. And this comes out in the book, along with the so-called balance. I'm running out of time, so to move ahead and conclude quickly, Fiji's Indian migrants established Gillion's reputation. He did become a historian of India, writing a well-regarded urban history of Medabad. And then he returned Fiji history again, the book on the Fiji Indians during the wartime years, the interwar years, I should say. In other words, Gillion had come the full circle, writing on the topic that was the subject of his Master of Arts thesis some 25 years early. And that's where I'll have to end. Thank you.